Dim the lights, grab a snack, and try to relax. But don't say I didn't warn you. When my grandmother died, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't believe she was really gone. Even in her final days, she had a way of watching you that made your skin crawl. Like she could see your thoughts before you formed them. Like death wouldn't dare touch her without asking permission. I inherited her house. A crumbling Victorian manor tucked at the edge of Black Ridge Hollow. No one wanted it. Its reputation was tangled in whispers. Townsfolk said the manor changed people. That those who stayed too long heard voices in the walls. Some even claimed to see her, long after she was buried. I moved in the day after the funeral. The will was brief. All it said was, the heirloom must never be removed from the house. If it calls to you, don't answer. No explanation. No signature. I didn't even know what the heirloom was. The manor smelled of mothballs and secrets. I began exploring, room by room. Dust choked the air. Old portraits lined the hallways, their eyes too lifelike. And the silence. It wasn't empty. It listened. On the third day, I found the drawer. It was part of an antique writing desk in the study. Locked, naturally. But it vibrated, softly. Not like something inside was moving, but like the drawer itself was, breathing. I pressed my ear to it. Whispers. Too low to understand, but they pulsed with need. I pulled back quickly, heart hammering. That night, I dreamed of her. My grandmother. She sat in her favorite chair, motionless. Her eyes were sewn shut with red thread, but her mouth moved. You opened the house. Now it opens you. I woke up choking. Blood on my pillow. A single key in my palm. It was warm, and it fit the drawer. The key fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for my hand all along. I should have walked away. I should have burned the desk. But curiosity is louder than fear when you've been touched by the unknown. I unlocked the drawer. The click echoed like a gunshot. I held my breath and slid it open. Inside, a velvet box, no larger than a jewelry case. Black, with golden filigree curling across the lid in patterns that twisted the more I stared. My fingers hovered over it, hesitant. And then I felt it. Something moved inside. Not the box itself, but something within it. Pacing, crawling, breathing. I should have shut the drawer. Instead, I opened the box. A locket lay inside. Silver, old, scratched from age or claw. Its chain was tangled in what looked like hair, thin strands, too pale to be mine. I stared at the locket, unable to move. The strands of hair wrapped around it weren't from any human I'd ever known, so light they were almost translucent, and they twitched like they were alive. The locket itself pulsed in my hand, not metaphorically. I mean it actually beat, like a heart remembering its rhythm. I held it up to the light. The surface was engraved with something, a face? No, not quite. It looked different from every angle. An old woman, a snarling beast, a gaping mouth. I tried to open it. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, gritting my teeth, until suddenly, snap. The locket clicked open, and I stumbled back. There was no photograph inside, no sentimental token, just a single eye, human, preserved somehow, still wet, still watching, and it blinked. I dropped the locket with a scream, and it hit the floor with a wet thud. The air in the study shifted instantly, heavier, colder. The portraits on the walls creaked, as though the people inside them had turned to look at me. Then I heard it. From behind me, "Give it back." I turned. No one was there, but the study door had closed, on its own. I lunged for the door, twisting the knob furiously. Locked. The key was gone. The locket still lay on the floor, its eye wide open now, darting from side to side like it was memorizing the room. "Give it back," the voice repeated. And it was locked. I turned toward the desk, and the velvet box was gone. In its place was a photo. A faded black and white picture of my grandmother, as a child. She stood in front of the same desk, same drawer, same study. But something was wrong. A dark, tall figure loomed behind her. Faceless. Just hands. Long, with too many fingers. Its arms wrapped around her shoulders like roots pulling into soil. The locket hung from her neck. Suddenly, the eye in the locket rolled upward and locked onto mine. The door burst open behind me, slamming so hard it cracked the wall. I didn't question it, I ran. But as I passed the hallway mirror, I saw it, a second reflection. Something walking behind me, invisible to the naked eye, but fully present in the glass. Slender, dressed in rotted funeral clothes, and hanging from its hand, the same locket. Its eye was closed now, but I knew it would open again, because it wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the bathtub, curtain open, lights on, locket sealed inside a glass jar under my bed. I thought distance might weaken its grip, but the eye still blinked. I could feel it inside my skull, like static in my bones. At 3:17 a.m., every mirror in the house cracked. Not shattered, cracked. A single split, right down the center, like something inside them was trying to crawl out. The next morning, I boarded them all up. Every reflective surface, even the water basin in the sink. But that didn't stop it. My phone screen flickered to life on its own. The locket's reflection showed there, too, only now it wasn't just the eye. There was a face forming behind it, rotting, and familiar. My grandmother, but not as I remembered her. She opened her sewn-shut eyes and screamed. The phone exploded in my hand. I bandaged the cuts and retreated to the attic, thinking maybe the answer was there. That's where she kept everything she didn't want the world to see. I found a trunk hidden beneath a moth-eaten tarp. Inside were dozens of small jars. Each held a different thing, a tooth, a tuft of hair, a tiny bird heart, and in the center, a journal. On the first page, written in that jagged, unmistakable handwriting, "The locket is not the heirloom. The curse is." I flipped through the journal, my fingers trembling. The entries weren't dated, but they were progressive. Each one more unhinged than the last, ink smudged, words scratched out violently. Some pages were burned at the edges, others soaked in something brown and dry. The first few entries were mundane. Notes about dreams, family history, warnings about the house. But then came this. The locket belonged to the first woman in our bloodline to strike a deal with it. She wanted to stop time. She wanted to keep what she loved. But curses are like wolves, they circle back. Another page. It doesn't possess people. It becomes them. Slowly. Voice first. Then reflection. Then bones. Then this. My mother locked the locket in the DRA. Inside me, like they were replacing who I was, one photograph at a time. Then I noticed it. The photos were changing in real time. My current clothes. My fresh cuts. My fear. One of the frames held me mid-turn, looking over my shoulder. I hadn't turned yet. Not in real life. But that version of me was already reacting to something behind me. I froze. The house was silent. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned, nothing there. Just the staircase and the dim glow of the hallway lamp. I let out a shaky breath. Then every light in the house went out at once. Not a flicker. A blackout. Sudden. Suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, forgetting it had shattered. The silence grew heavy again, almost liquid, like I was underwater. Then, tap, tap tap, tap tap tap. The sound came from inside the walls. No, closer, under my skin. The eye in the locket blinked again. From the shadows, a voice hissed, "You are the heirloom now." I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen until dawn, every light flickering overhead like it was deciding whether to stay on. The locket, still sealed in its jar, thumped against the glass all night, like a heartbeat desperate to sync with mine. "You are the heirloom now." The words echoed in my head like they were stitched there. At sunrise, I left the house. I needed answers, proof I wasn't losing my mind. I drove straight to the Black Ridge Archives, an old stone library run by an even older woman named Mabel. She knew my grandmother. "Catherine," she said, squinting at me, "you look just like her. Same eyes." I told her everything, the locket, the voice, the pictures, the journal. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she reached under her desk and pulled out an old file, yellowed, stiff with age. On the tab was a name, Eleanor Blackridge. My great-great-grandmother. She was the first, Mabel whispered. She summoned something, called it the hollow guest, said it came to fill the spaces grief left behind. I flipped through the papers, grainy photos, symbols drawn in ash, handwritten letters to no one. Then I found it, a portrait. Eleanor, wearing the locket, and behind her, faint but visible, a dark silhouette with 1,000 white eyes, its arms coiled around her shoulders. Beneath the image, scrawled in red ink, "The heirloom must never leave the bloodline. If it does, it finds another way in." I asked Mabel what happened to Eleanor. She just said, "She never died. She transferred." I left the archives shaking. When I got back home, the jar was shattered. And the locket was gone. The glass was everywhere, on the floor, in the hallway carpet, glinting like broken teeth. I stepped over it, careful, but something crunched underfoot. Not glass, not wood, a tooth, human, small, fresh. I froze. The locket was gone, but in its place, on the counter, was a trail of dark, wet footprints leading out of the kitchen, bare feet, long toes, splayed like an animal's. They glistened.
"We've been waiting for you to come back home." I couldn't move. The thing in the dress stood perfectly still, head tilted, lips stretched into an imitation of my grandmother's smile. But wrong. Too many teeth, skin too smooth, like a mask pulled too tight. And around its neck the locket pulsed, its eye now a deep shade of crimson, as if it had tasted something it liked. "You're not her," I whispered. The thing giggled. It tried to sound human. But laughter shouldn't echo from under the floorboards. "You think inheritance is money," it said. "Inheritance is memory. Inheritance is binding. You carry us now." I backed away, bumping into the doorway. The light flickered overhead. When it steadied, the figure was gone. But the locket still hovered in the air, suspended by nothing. Then it snapped forward like it was on a chain I couldn't see, flying straight toward my chest. It stopped an inch from my heart. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the door. Only. There was no outside. The porch was gone. The trees were painted on a black canvas. The lawn dissolved into fog. I screamed, reached for the doorknob again, but the house behind me had vanished, and standing in its place was a room, just one, the study, the desk, the photos, the mirror, and on the desk, the journal, a new page open, and on it, in my handwriting, "She let it in, so it stayed." Behind me, the locket dropped, around my neck. The clasp clicked shut. The sound of the creaking door echoed through the hallway, its low groan unsettling. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes locked on the tarnished brass handle that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Behind her, the house felt colder, the silence pressing down like a heavy weight. She had left the attic door ajar only moments ago, yet now, as she turned around, it was fully closed. Had she imagined it? The chill in her spine told her otherwise. Taking a deep breath, she reached out to open the door, the wood resisting at first, then slowly giving way. The attic air was stale, thick with dust and old secrets. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped inside, the faint flicker of the candlelight casting long shadows across the room. The mirror was the first thing she saw. Its glass was cracked, but it stood proudly against the wall, as if daring her to look into it. A soft thud behind her made her spin around, but there was nothing, just the emptiness of the attic, the forgotten remnants of a life that once was. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat when she noticed something new on the floor. A small box, its corners frayed with age, lying just beside the mirror. She knelt to inspect it, her hands trembling. Inside, wrapped in a layer of old velvet, was a delicate piece of jewelry, a brooch shaped like a raven with jet-black stones for eyes. It was the heirloom. She lifted it carefully, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. As she did, a sharp, whispering voice seemed to echo from the walls, just out of reach. "Take it." Evelyn recoiled, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. She slid the brooch into her pocket, standing up to face the mirror one last time. It wasn't her reflection that stared back at her, but someone else. Her breath caught, her hand instinctively going to her throat. A figure stood behind her in the mirror, just out of sight in the room. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was as if someone was lurking just beyond the glass, watching. The air around her grew thick, heavier with each passing second.
Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she turned, but the figure was gone. The attic was still. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The brooch in her pocket seemed to weigh heavier now, as if it had become an anchor to something dark and ancient. She slowly approached the mirror, her fingers twitching with the need to touch it, to see if the coldness of the glass was real or a product of her mind. Her hand hovered just inches from the surface. The reflection that stared back at her was hers, still hers, but there was something unsettling in the way her image trembled, as if it were struggling to maintain its form. Without warning, the glass rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop of rain. Evelyn gasped and stepped back, but it was too late. The mirror seemed to pull at her, its surface undulating as though it were alive. And then, she heard it. A whisper, cold and sharp, brushing against her ear like a cruel caress. "You've awakened it." The voice was no longer in her head. It was in the room with her. The air around her grew thick, suffocating. She clutched the brooch in her pocket, her hand trembling violently. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. The figure was there again, but now it wasn't just standing behind her. It was moving, its dark form slipping out of the mirror, its hands reaching towards her. Evelyn screamed, stumbling back as the figure stepped fully into the attic, its presence more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. It was a shadow of a person, faceless, its limbs long and disjointed, like something that didn't belong in this world. The brooch burned in her pocket, its dark energy pulsing in time with her rapidly beating heart. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two hollow voids of darkness, pulling her gaze toward them, dragging her into their emptiness. Her hand shot out to grab the attic door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped, the figure now inches from her, its cold, unnatural breath brushing against her skin. The voice spoke again, this time louder, commanding. "Give it to me." Without thinking, Evelyn yanked the brooch from her pocket and threw it toward the shadow, desperate to be rid of it. The brooch flew through the air, its raven-shaped form glowing with an eerie light. She turned toward the attic door again, but this time, it swung open on its own. The dark hallway beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows swallowing everything in their path. It was as if the house itself was breathing, drawing her deeper into its dark embrace. Her instincts screamed for her to flee, to run from the house, from the curse she had awakened. But she couldn't move. The weight of something unseen pressed against her chest, immobilizing her. Her body felt like it no longer belonged to her, as if it had been taken by something far older, far darker than anything she had known. The voice came again, but it was different now, closer, sharper, and unmistakably malicious. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its tone venomous, dripping with malice. Then, something caught her eye. A figure, barely visible in the flickering candlelight, stood at the far end of the hallway. It was not the same as the shadow from the mirror, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it. The figure was tall, its face hidden in the folds of a hood, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. Evelyn's pulse quickened as the figure began to approach, each step heavier than the last, the floorboards groaning under its weight. It didn't speak, but she could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, drawing nearer. The closer it came, the clearer the details became. The figure wore a cloak woven from shadows, and its hands, if they could be called hands, were long, spindly, with fingers that ended in jagged, blackened nails. A sense of dread coiled around Evelyn's chest, suffocating her, and she instinctively took a step back. But then, it stopped, and its head tilted in her direction. The silence was deafening. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn's mouth went dry as the figure raised one of its hands and pointed directly at her, its finger long and unnaturally stiff. The gesture was almost mocking, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. "You shouldn't have taken it," the voice came, not from the figure's mouth, but from all around her, filling the air with a chilling resonance. "It belongs to me, and now you belong to it." Her stomach lurched, and suddenly, the darkness of the hallway seemed to swell and close in on her. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her skin, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into the shadows. And then, as if to answer the figure's claim, the brooch in her pocket flared to life. Its cold metal burned against her skin, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly energy. The darkness around her seemed to respond, swirling, coiling like a living thing, as if it were alive, hungry for her soul. Evelyn gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts as the figure took a step forward, and then another. The air around her seemed to warp, bending with the weight of its presence. In that moment, she knew, there was no escape, not from the house, not from the brooch, and not from the thing that had claimed her. But perhaps, there was one way out. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached for the brooch and held it in front of her, the raven's dark eyes gleaming in the flickering light. She whispered, barely audible, "I release you." The figure froze, and the house groaned as if it were alive, reacting to her words. And then, everything went silent. The silence was absolute, pressing down on Evelyn like a physical weight. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a frantic reminder that something was terribly wrong. The figure in the hallway had stopped moving, its form frozen in place, but the air around her still felt thick with menace. The brooch, still clutched tightly in her hand, burned against her skin, its unnatural heat seeping into her bones. For a moment, Evelyn thought she might have imagined the words that had escaped her lips. "I release you." What could they possibly have meant? She didn't even understand what she had released or who, or what, she had been speaking to. But as the minutes passed, she realized that the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a lull before something far worse. The figure did not move, but its presence was still palpable, filling the air with a malignant energy. The shadows in the hallway seemed to grow deeper, darker, stretching toward her as though they were alive, hungry. Then, slowly, impossibly, the figure tilted its head again, as though considering her words, testing their meaning. Its blackened fingers twitched, its long, gnarled nails scraping the air like claws. The faintest sound of a breath, slow and ragged, reached her ears. "Ears. You cannot unbind it," the voice whispered, now no longer echoing from the walls but coming from the figure itself, its hollow tone carrying a terrifying weight. "Once it is claimed, there is no release." Evelyn's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Whatever she had unleashed, it had been tied to her the moment she touched the brooch. The shadows that filled the house, the mirror that had fractured, the malevolent force that now sought her, she had awakened something that should have been left undisturbed. But she couldn't stop. The brooch pulsed with a strange, almost sentient force, urging her to act. It was no longer a piece of jewelry, it was a beacon, a guide to something far darker. She could feel its power tugging at her, its call luring her into the abyss. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice now barely a rasp. "You will learn what it is to be bound. You will learn what it is to be consumed." With a sudden, violent motion, the figure extended its arm toward her, its hand jerking through the air like a whip. The shadows surged forward, swarming in, encircling her, filling the space with a choking, suffocating darkness. She tried to move, to run, but her legs refused to obey. The darkness pressed in closer, the temperature plummeting, until she could feel the cold sinking into her very soul. A whisper, barely audible, came from the brooch. "Run." The word was a lifeline, a final warning. But Evelyn was paralyzed, caught in the grasp of the figure's unrelenting presence. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her in, and she could feel the pull of something far worse than mere death, a consumption of her very essence. The figure took another step, then another, its shape becoming clearer as the shadows around her parted. She could see its face now, or rather, the absence of it. The face was a hollow void, a dark pit that seemed to suck in everything around it, pulling her toward it. Her pulse raced, her vision began to blur as the darkness encroached further. She felt the brooch tremble in her hand, its dark power flickering in time with her heartbeat. There was no escape. She could feel herself slipping away, her body no longer hers to control. The shadows were devouring her, taking everything she had, her thoughts, her memories, her very existence. But then, with a surge of desperation, she managed to force her legs to move, stumbling backward. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know if it was too late to escape, but something deep inside told her she had one chance. One final chance to break free. The brooch flared with light, blinding in its intensity. For a split second, the figure recoiled, its face contorting in agony as if the brooch's light was a poison to it. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She ran. The shadows tried to cling to her, to pull her back into the darkness, but the brooch seemed to burn them away, its light pushing back the encroaching gloom. She reached the door of the attic, throwing it open with all her strength, and bolted down the stairs. But the house was no longer the same. The walls seemed to warp and shift as she descended, the air thick with the stench of decay. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and the light in the hallway flickered in an unsettling rhythm, as if the house itself were alive, aware of her every movement. She could hear the whispering again, but it wasn't coming from the brooch. It was coming from all around her, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air she breathed. "You cannot outrun what you have summoned," the voice whispered, its tone mocking, cruel. "You cannot hide from what you have become." Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she raced down the hallway, the oppressive weight of the house pushing against her every step. The brooch was still in her hand, its light flickering weakly as if it were losing its power. She reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had sealed her in, trapping her in its endless maze. She could feel the figure drawing closer, its presence suffocating, a dark specter she couldn't outrun. And then, from the depths of the house, she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hall. The figure was coming for her. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, each beat drowning out the sound of her frantic breath. The door refused to budge, its frame solid and unyielding, like the house itself had grown roots beneath the earth, binding her to it. She slammed her shoulder against it, desperate, but the heavy wood didn't give an inch. The footsteps grew louder, each one deliberate and impossibly slow. The brooch in her hand began to burn again, its pulse erratic, almost frantic. She barely registered the pain as its dark energy coursed through her veins, sending an icy chill through her body. Her fingers tightened around it instinctively, as though she had no choice but to hold on. A whisper brushed her ear, cold and mocking. "You cannot escape, child. You are bound to this place now. To it." Evelyn's blood ran cold, but she refused to give in. She was not going to be consumed. Not now, not after everything. She had come too far, fought too hard to let this ancient evil swallow her whole. The footsteps were so close now, the sound of them reverberating off the walls, vibrating through the very foundation of the house. She could feel the weight of the figure's presence, an invisible force that pressed against her like a suffocating hand. Then, without warning, the brooch flared once more, its light blinding, more intense than before. More intense than before. The darkness around her seemed to recoil, the shadows pulling back, twisting and writhing as if in pain. "Leave me alone!" Evelyn screamed, her voice raw, desperate. But the figure did not stop. It stepped into the doorway, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was still shrouded in shadows, its face hidden in the dark folds of its hood. But she could feel its eyes on her, empty, hollow eyes that saw right through her very soul. "You've awakened me," the voice hissed, low and guttural. "And now, you will know the price of your curiosity." Evelyn's legs shook beneath her, but she fought the instinct to crumble. She had to do something, anything. She glanced around, her eyes desperate for an escape. The walls seemed to pulse, the very air around her thick with an unnatural energy. There was no way out, except for one. The brooch. Without thinking, she lifted it high above her head, its raven-shaped form glowing like a beacon in the dark. The house groaned, the walls shuddering as if reacting to her movement. She didn't care. She had no choice now. She had to take a risk, to do something before it was too late. She shouted the words, her voice shaky but loud, "I banish you." For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows pressed in tighter, the figure standing motionless, its presence overwhelming. Then, without warning, the brooch flared to life, its dark energy exploding outward in a shockwave of light. The force of it was staggering, knocking Evelyn back several steps, her body slamming into the door. The figure shrieked, a horrible, high-pitched wail that echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls. It reached out toward her, its hands claws, its fingers stretching impossibly long. But the brooch's light was too strong, too powerful. The shadows that surrounded the figure began to burn away, disintegrating in the radiant light. More intense than before. The darkness around her seemed to recoil, the shadows pulling back, twisting and writhing as if in pain. "Leave me alone!" Evelyn screamed, her voice raw, desperate. But the figure did not stop. It stepped into the doorway, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was still shrouded in shadows, its face hidden in the dark folds of its hood. But she could feel its eyes on her, empty, hollow eyes that saw right through her very soul. "You've awakened me," the voice hissed, low and guttural. "And now, you will know the price of your curiosity." Evelyn's legs shook beneath her, but she fought the instinct to crumble. She had to do something, anything. She glanced around, her eyes desperate for an escape. The walls seemed to pulse, the very air around her thick with an unnatural energy. There was no way out, except for one. The brooch. Without thinking, she lifted it high above her head, its raven-shaped form glowing like a beacon in the dark. The house groaned, the walls shuddering as if reacting to her movement. She didn't care. She had no choice now. She had to take a risk, to do something before it was too late. She shouted the words, her voice shaky but loud, "I banish you." For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows pressed in tighter, the figure standing motionless, its presence overwhelming. Then, without warning, the brooch flared to life, its dark energy exploding outward in a shockwave of light. The force of it was staggering, knocking Evelyn back several steps, her body slamming into the door. The figure shrieked, a horrible, high-pitched wail that echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls. It reached out toward her, its hands claws, its fingers stretching impossibly long. But the brooch's light was too strong, too powerful. The shadows that surrounded the figure began to burn away, disintegrating in the radiant light. The figure screamed again, but this time it was a scream of agony, of something being torn apart, ripped away. The shadows collapsed, swirling into nothingness as the light from the brooch continued to expand, filling the entire room with a blinding glow. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the figure shattered, breaking apart like glass, the darkness vanishing with it. The brooch's light dimmed to nothing, its power spent. The house, once filled with suffocating darkness, began to quiet, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. Evelyn stood frozen, her body trembling, not daring to move, afraid the nightmare might return at any moment. But nothing came. The house was still. It was over. For the first time since she'd entered the house, Evelyn felt the quiet, the stillness, wrap around her like a blanket. The suffocating tension in the air had lifted, leaving her with a strange sense of peace. The brooch, now dark and cold in her hand, felt like nothing more than an ordinary piece of metal. Yet, as she stared at it, she knew one thing for sure. Evelyn stood alone in the darkened hallway, her body trembling with exhaustion, the brooch now an icy weight in her palm. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, frozen, processing what had just happened. The house was silent, but the eerie stillness felt temporary, as though it was waiting for something. The shadows that once clung to the walls had receded, but a faint, lingering chill clung to the air. The once oppressive atmosphere had softened, but there was a feeling in the back of her mind, a warning that refused to fade. The brooch felt like a curse, cold and unyielding, its dark power still alive in her hand. She looked down at it, her fingers tightening around the raven-shaped piece of metal. It seemed different now. No longer simply a family heirloom, no longer a relic, it felt like something far more sinister, something that had lived for centuries, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. It was a connection to something ancient, something that should have stayed hidden in the depths of time. And now, it was bound to her, just as the voice in the shadows had promised. The thought made her stomach turn, but she pushed it down. There was no time to think about that now. She had to get out. She had to leave this cursed house behind before it could consume her. With one last, lingering glance at the hallway behind her, Evelyn turned and ran toward the front door. Her footsteps echoed through the empty house as she reached for the handle, but the moment her fingers made contact with the cool brass, she stopped. It didn't feel right. The house, once so suffocating, felt alive again. There was something wrong with the door, as if it were no longer simply an exit but a barrier, a wall that refused to let her go. She tugged at the handle, harder this time, but it didn't budge. Panic surged in her chest. Her breath quickened, and she pulled again, her nails scraping against the doorframe. It was as though the house itself was testing her, daring her to try and escape. And then, she heard it. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. The soft shuffle of footsteps, barely audible against the silence of the house. Her pulse skipped a beat as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was approaching her. She turned toward the sound, her eyes searching the hallway, but there was nothing. Just the dim glow of the flickering lamp casting long, ominous shadows along the walls. No, no, no. She backed away from the door, her hand trembling as it gripped the brooch tightly. The footsteps were closer now, echoing louder in the space, though she couldn't see who was making them. The floor creaked. She spun around, her heart in her throat. A shadow moved across the floor, dark and formless, its shape difficult to discern. It slid along the walls like liquid darkness, creeping toward her. It's not over. It's never over. The thought slammed into her with terrifying clarity. The house had changed. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone, but something else had taken its place. The shadows themselves seemed to have grown more aware, more active. With a surge of fear, Evelyn ran down the hallway, away from the door, away from the dark presence creeping behind her. She reached the stairs, but as she began to ascend, she heard a low, guttural growl. It was like the sound of something waking, something buried deep beneath the floorboards, something that had been sleeping, waiting for its chance. The air around her seemed to thicken. The brooch burned in her hand, its heat now unbearable. She glanced down at it, and for a moment, she saw something, a flicker of movement in its reflection. A face, or something that resembled a face, staring back at her from the depths of the dark metal. The raven's eyes seemed to gleam with an insidious awareness, as if it had a mind of its own. Her breath hitched. It's here. She turned back toward the hallway, her mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be somewhere she could hide, somewhere the house's influence wouldn't reach. But the house wouldn't let her leave. She could feel its pulse now, a slow, rhythmic thrum beneath her feet. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, shifting ever so slightly. She could feel its presence growing, pressing against her, closing in. Its raven-shaped figure pulsing with an energy that made her skin tingle, her nerves crackle. The house groaned again, louder this time, as though it were alive, as though it were aware of her every movement. Evelyn stumbled back from the door, her heart thundering in her chest. The shadows that had once seemed distant were now closing in, their tendrils curling around the edges of the room, seeping into the corners like a slow tide of black ink. She couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. She needed to leave, to get away from this place before it consumed her completely. But the house was alive. She could feel it, its pulse under her feet, in the walls, in the very air she breathed. Every step she took felt like a betrayal to her body, as if it were being pulled towards something far darker, something older. An unfamiliar hunger gnawing at her insides. A need, a desire for something dark and unknown. Please. Evelyn whispered, her voice barely a breath, as if speaking aloud could chase away the horror creeping through her mind. Please, let me go. But the house answered with nothing but an eerie silence, heavy and suffocating. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if the very walls of the house were breathing in sync with her, drawing in her fear and her terror. A cold laugh echoed through the room, sending a chill down her spine. It wasn't the voice of the house or the brooch this time, but something else. Something new. Evelyn's head snapped up as the shadows in the corner of the room shifted, twisting into a shape, a form. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and slender, wrapped in a cloak of shifting shadows. Its face was hidden, its eyes two glowing points of light like distant stars in the void. It stood motionless for a moment, watching her, as if savoring her fear. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She knew this figure. She had seen it before, in the reflection of the mirror. The one who had watched her, who had followed her. No, she gasped, scrambling backward, her hand tightening around the brooch, as if its cold metal might offer her some protection. No, please, the figure took a step forward, its movement slow, deliberate. Each step it took seemed to drain the light from the room, leaving only the cold, creeping darkness in its wake. You thought you could release me, it said, its voice smooth and terrible. But you chose me. And now, you will pay the price. The figure raised one long, spindly hand, and with it, the shadows responded. They moved like living things, like tendrils reaching toward her, curling around her legs, pulling her into their grasp. Evelyn screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She kicked and struggled, but the shadows were stronger, more relentless than anything she had ever known. They wrapped around her like chains, tightening with every movement she made. "You were never meant to escape," the figure whispered. "The brooch calls to you. It binds you to me." With a sudden, violent surge of energy, Evelyn ripped herself free from the shadows, her mind screaming with panic and desperation. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing in her chest, but as she turned to run, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to warp, to bend and twist, as though the house itself were alive, reshaping itself to trap her. Her eyes darted to the door, the only way out, but it was no longer where it had been. The entire house had rearranged itself. The hallway was gone. The kitchen had swallowed the exit hole, closing off every avenue of escape. "Where will you go?" the figure whispered, its voice now a growl. "There is no escape." The shadows grew heavier, thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. Evelyn stumbled back, her chest tight with terror, but then, she remembered the brooch. She held it up to the darkness, the raven's eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its power surging through her once more. "I won't let you take me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and defiance. The figure froze, its glowing eyes narrowing in disbelief. It took a step back, but Evelyn didn't give in. With all her strength, she raised the brooch higher, its light blazing brighter, pushing back against the darkness. But even as the figure recoiled, Evelyn knew it wasn't over. She hadn't won. She hadn't escaped. The house knew her now. The brooch knew her. And sooner or later, it would come for her again. The light from the brooch blazed through the room, cutting through the suffocating darkness, but Evelyn could feel it flickering, weakening. Her hand, trembling from the weight of the brooch, could barely hold on to it. The energy that had surged through her moments ago seemed to be draining away, seeping back into the walls, back into the house. The figure stood at the center of the room, its eyes gleaming with hatred, but there was something else, a flicker of recognition, a brief hesitation in its movements. The shadows seemed to recoil from the brooch, but only for a moment. Then, as if the figure had given a silent command, the darkness surged forward once more, more powerful than before. The walls groaned and shifted, the air thickening, the space constricting around her. Evelyn's breath hitched. She couldn't hold on much longer. The brooch's glow had dimmed to a faint, dying pulse. The weight of the shadows pressing in on her felt like a physical force, suffocating her, dragging her into the depths. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth, desperation flooding her senses. She couldn't lose now. Not when she was so close. The figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, like the embodiment of the house itself. The shadows parted as it approached, its form stretching impossibly tall, the black cloak it wore billowing like smoke. It had no face, just hollow voids where eyes should be, emptiness, staring into her soul. "You cannot resist me, child," the figure said, its voice deep and cold, vibrating through the very floor beneath her. "You are mine. The brooch was never yours to control. It has always belonged to me." The word struck her like a slap, and for a moment, Evelyn faltered. She had thought the brooch was her weapon, her means of escape. But now, standing before her, the figure made it clear that it had always been a tool of something far more ancient and powerful than she had ever understood. The house seemed to shudder, the entire foundation groaning as if alive. The air grew colder, the darkness swirling around her, suffocating her will to fight. But Evelyn couldn't give up. Not yet. There was still a chance. With every ounce of strength she had left, she raised the brooch again, holding it toward the figure. The raven's eyes flickered, dim but still burning with a strange, malicious light. She could feel the connection, the pull of its energy, as it fought against her, trying to drag her back into its embrace. "No," she cried, her voice shaking, but firm. "You don't own me." The brooch pulsed once more, sending a jagged burst of light into the figure's form. The shadows around it screamed, writhing in agony, but the figure did not retreat. Instead, it laughed, low and guttural, as if mocking her efforts. "You think you are free? You are already bound," it sneered. "This house will never let you go. This curse will never let you go." The darkness surged forward again, and this time, it was stronger than ever. It reached for her with tangible claws, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down toward the floor. Evelyn fought with everything she had, but the weight of the darkness was too much. She was being swallowed whole. But then, something shifted. A sudden clarity pierced through the fog of fear clouding her mind. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. The brooch. The raven. The dark power it held, it wasn't just her enemy. It was her connection, her key to something greater. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the darkness wash over her. But instead of succumbing to it, she let it consume her. She felt the brooch hum in her hand, its power coursing through her veins, merging with her own. She had been running from it for so long, trying to fight it, trying to deny it. But now, she knew, this darkness was part of her. The house had chosen her. She had chosen it. With a final, decisive motion, Evelyn thrust the brooch forward, letting the raven's power surge out of her like an unstoppable force. The house screamed. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into the shadows as the brooch's light expanded outward, overwhelming the darkness in a violent wave. The walls cracked and groaned as if they were being torn apart, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Evelyn felt as if the entire house was about to collapse, to devour her entirely. But then, silence. The light from the brooch faded, leaving nothing but a faint glow. The oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, and the house seemed to settle, its groaning subsiding into a deep, echoing quiet. Evelyn stood frozen, breathless, as she surveyed the room. The figure was gone, the shadows gone. The brooch in her hand was cold, its raven eyes dim. But something was different. The air was clearer, lighter, as though the house had released its grip on her, if only for a moment. She looked around. The house was still there, standing as it always had, but it felt less alive. Less hostile. Her pulse still racing, Evelyn took a tentative step forward. She didn't trust the stillness. The house had a way of shifting, of hiding its true nature beneath the surface. But for now, it seemed she had won. She had survived. But as she turned toward the door again, ready to leave, a voice, soft, seductive, whispered from behind her. "You think you're free?" Evelyn's heart stopped. The brooch in her hand pulsed once more, its light flickering weakly in response. "I will always find you." She didn't look back. She couldn't. But she knew, deep down, that the house was not done with her. Not by a long shot. Evelyn stumbled backward, her body still trembling from the lingering sensation of the brooch's power coursing through her veins. She had felt the darkness, its weight, its oppressive presence, lift for a moment. But now, as she turned her gaze back toward the hallway, she knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The house had shown her its true nature, and it would not simply let her go. The voice echoed in her mind, soft and deadly. "I will always find you." She had hoped, in some naive corner of her mind, that destroying the figure, banishing the shadows, would have set her free. But deep down, she had always known that this was never just about the brooch. It was about the house. The ancient force that lingered within its walls, that breathed through the cracks in the floors, that whispered in the darkness. Her fingers tightened around the brooch, now cold and still, its raven eyes dim. It felt almost lifeless. But Evelyn knew better than to trust appearances. The brooch had power, yes, but it was also a link, a bond, something that tied her to this house, to whatever it was that lurked here. She turned toward the front door again, desperate for an escape, but when she reached for the handle, her heart sank. The door, once so solid, was now warped, twisted, as though it had been bent by invisible hands. It no longer felt like an exit, but an entrance to something far darker. And then, a low groan rumbled through the floor beneath her feet. The entire house seemed to shift, as though it were alive, stretching and creaking with the weight of some terrible force pressing against its walls. The lights flickered once more, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Evelyn's breath quickened. She could hear the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. The house was calling to her. No, demanding her attention. The air grew thick with a strange, electric charge, and the brooch in her hand pulsed once more, its raven eyes flaring bright. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, swirling with a malevolent energy that made her stomach turn. She spun around, her eyes searching the darkened hallway, but it was empty. The silence stretched on, suffocating and unbroken. But then, something moved. Something wrong. The shadows flickered and shifted, almost alive, and from the darkness, a figure began to materialize. Evelyn's blood ran cold. It was him. The figure from the mirror. The one that had followed her, that had haunted her every step. His presence was like a stain on the air, a weight that pressed against her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. "You think you've won," the figure whispered, his voice smooth and deadly. "But you are nothing but a vessel. You always have been." Evelyn took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to run. She had to get away from him, from this place. But no matter where she turned, there was no escape. The figure's presence pressed in on her, suffocating and cold. It was as if the walls of the house themselves had closed in, trapping her in the tight, claustrophobic space. Every breath felt heavier, the air thick with an oppressive force she could not understand. The figure stood motionless, its eyes glowing brighter now, staring into her soul. "You cannot run from me," it said, its voice low and venomous. "You belong to this house. The brooch, it has already claimed you." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the brooch, but the weight of its power seemed to be slipping from her grasp. The raven's eyes were dull now, no longer burning with the same intensity they had before. It was like a tether had snapped, the connection weakening, and with it, her strength. "No," she whispered, by her defiance. It didn't respond right away, but Evelyn could feel the energy in the room growing more intense, a pressure she couldn't escape. "You are weak," the figure said finally. "The power you feel is not yours. It was given to you. And now, you will be my vessel. Your soul, your very essence will fuel the house." Evelyn recoiled, panic rising in her chest. She had thought the brooch had given her strength, had thought it had given her control, but now, it felt as though it was draining her. The power that once surged through her veins was fading, leaving nothing but cold emptiness. Her body ached. Her mind felt foggy. It was as if the house itself were pulling at the edges of her thoughts, twisting them, forcing her to surrender. The brooch pulsed once more, but it was weaker now, barely a flicker of the strength it had held before. And then, Evelyn understood. The brooch wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a shield. It was a key. The figure took a step forward, its form towering over her. You have no choice. The brooch binds you to the house. And now, it will take what it is owed. With a sudden, brutal movement, it reached out toward her, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against her skin. The moment it touched her, Evelyn's body went rigid, an electric shock of pain coursing through her, as though the house itself was seeping into her veins. She screamed, her voice echoing through the hall, but it was swallowed by the walls. The darkness pressed in on her, filling every corner of her mind. The brooch's faint glow dimmed entirely, leaving her in utter blackness. The figure's laugh, low and cold, reverberated through the room. This is it. You are mine. But in that moment, Evelyn felt something stir within her. A flicker of defiance. The brooch may have been a key, but it was not the only key to this house. She had always been more than just its victim. As the figure's hands closed around her, she brought her trembling hand up, feeling the brooches. Wait once more. It was no longer a weapon, it was a link. A link to something darker, but also to something stronger. The air around her shifted, and for a brief moment, she felt it, a presence, a force beyond the figure, beyond the house. Something that had been waiting. Something that had always been there, buried beneath the weight of time. Her body shuddered as the presence surged through her, filling her chest, filling her mind with power. The figure faltered, its grip loosening, its eyes widening in disbelief. What? What is this? It growled, but Evelyn didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too focused on the strength surging through her veins, coursing through the very fabric of the house. She closed her eyes and whispered, I choose myself. The brooch flared with an unearthly light, its raven eyes glowing brighter than ever before. The shadows recoiled, retreating from the light, their form twisting and wailing as if they were being torn apart. For a moment, there was silence. And then, everything shattered. The curse had been broken. The brooch had served its purpose. She took a deep breath, watching the house crumble around her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she smiled. It was over. The end.